So, thanks for officially coming to class today. I appreciate it. Hopefully this will clear up any questions you have. If you had anything from last time you wanted to ask, just wanted to show you the book. Right in front of the Give Me Liberty 6th edition. Mine's purple. I've heard some of you have gotten it online, which is good. And if you have the 5th edition, I was trying to compare 5th and 6th this morning, at least in the first couple of chapters, and it looks really, really similar, so you should be okay. My just overall quick look at both books to see what the difference was the 6th edition has a lot about Trump in it, and of course there's not about Trump in the 5th edition because he hadn't been elected yet. And what a surprise that was to me. I'm just saying, I can remember I told my students it really ruined my credibility as a history teacher because, you know, they have the 25 people in the primary, and my students, I was high school students, like, who do you think is going to be president? And I went, all I know is it won't be Trump, because it, you know, not traditional at all. So it was really interesting, I think. Historically interesting. Well, I'll try really hard not to bring in, you know, actual political views about stuff like that until we get closer to actually talking about, you know, more current thoughts. All right, so kind of wanted to start with just a general discussion of the Civil War, which I know, I mean, it's not where our class starts, but just to kind of make sure we're all sort of on the same page with the Civil War. Typically, most people see, it seems like a fair rendition as well, most people see the Civil War as a conflict between the North and the South for a variety of reasons. Sort of depends on, you know, your perspective and maybe your 8th grade history teacher a little bit. I know at the high school I taught at, they had an 8th grade history teacher who just really drilled into them states' rights and it wasn't slavery. So then when I got them, it's like, Ms. Cerna, you're wrong. It really wasn't about slavery. And I'll go like, okay. But you can't overlook the importance of the institution of slavery as part of the Civil War, because I'm really sure we wouldn't have had a Civil War about tariff policy. But I think in general, for our purposes, we just need to know there was a Civil War. It was pretty much the North versus the South, or the Union versus the Confederacy. And there's lots of different nicknames for both groups, or names for both groups, none of which really matter to us for this class. The North eventually wins the Civil War. When it first starts, the North thinks it'll happen very quickly, that the South isn't going to be very successful because they have fewer resources, they have fewer people by, you know, and fewer resources and people by quite a bit. They don't have a very strong industrial capability. I think the other odd thing that students often think, not you, I'm sure, but other students, is that the North was just a whole bunch of factories and the South was a whole bunch of farms. The South was a lot of farms, that part is right, but there aren't a whole bunch of factories in the 1860s just yet. There are some, but the North is not a completely industrialized place. And the South is primarily growing cotton. So it's why they call it the Cotton Kingdom, that sort of thing. So they don't always grow enough food to feed their people and their troops, that sort of thing. So that's going to be a production issue after the first couple of years of the Civil War. They actually are going to run out of food toward the end of the war. And so their government tries to convince their farmers to start growing food instead of cotton. And they won't do it because they've made so much money growing cotton, but they really don't have anybody to sell the cotton to during the Civil War, because the North has done a pretty good job of blockading the coast, so they can't sell cotton to anybody, so they're not making any money. So what they're doing is smuggling cotton to manufacturers in the North. So they're kind of selling cotton to the enemy so that they can make money, but they still don't have enough food to feed their troops. So there are lots of issues for the South during the Civil War. I would be remiss to point out as well, because I know there's probably at least 2 or 3 of you in here who are military historians. Typically, most people think the better military strategists were in the South. Lots of plantation owners sent one son to college overseas and one son to West Point. So lots and lots of important people from West Point, most notably, of course, Robert E. Lee, but Stonewall Jackson wasn't bad either, are fighting for the South. And there aren't as many, I mean, there's certainly some scholarly people fighting for the North, but the scholarly people aren't quite as adept at actually leading the military as guys like, say, Ulysses S. Grant, who graduated lower in his class, but was a better field general than most of the folks in the North. Okay. And so the war drags on for 4 years. It's 1861 to 1865. The first couple of years, the South wins most of the battles. There's a turning point in the middle, and that's about the time you get the Emancipation Proclamation and the Gettysburg Address. And then toward the end of the war, the South is really just running out of stuff, and it's very clear that the North is going to win. Now, in the middle of all that, because, I mean, you're living through our modern times, you know, in the middle of all that, you need a presidential election as well. So they had one of those too toward the end of the Civil War, 1864. And so it wasn't really a for sure thing that Abraham Lincoln was going to win the presidential election. Oh, and in case you're wondering, like, do you need to know all this for the quiz and stuff? No, this is really just background. So people always want to know that, and I didn't think about starting off with that. No, this part is not necessarily on the quiz. Although where we're headed, presidential election is kind of important to understanding why you ended up with such a weird president during Reconstruction. So Abraham Lincoln's running for re-election. His vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, I think passes away. Yeah, he passes away. He's got to replace him. It's very clear that the war is going to end. The battles start to really move toward the North. The momentum, really moves toward the North in 1864. So it becomes clearer and clearer that people who are opposing Abraham Lincoln are not going to be terribly successful. So he's going to win the re-election. So he decides to pick a very unusual person to be vice president. And, you know, I was thinking that, and again, the goal not to be political at all, but, you know, U.S. history teachers, so I watched the Democrats last week, I'm watching the Republicans this week, and Mike Pence is giving the big vice presidential speech last night in front of Fort McHenry, and it's lovely and beautiful and patriotic and all that stuff. And all I can think is, how strangely different are Mike Pence and Donald Trump? Could there be 2 more different people? So then I posted on Facebook so that my brothers, my dad, and I could talk about politics, or history mostly. Who do you think were the weirdest combo with president and vice president? And, you know, Lincoln and Johnson could be up there, because what Lincoln does is he decides to pick a Southern Democrat to be his vice president, and they call it the Constitutional Union Party. And the reason that he picks Andrew Johnson is Andrew Johnson had opposed secession and continued to attend the Senate during the Civil War. He's the only Southern politician who did that. So Lincoln wants to reward his loyalty to the Union, and also send a message to the South that maybe you've suffered enough and we want to bring you back together without punishing you. Because, I mean, they lost the war, most of the battles were in the South, their economy was devastated, they had a large percentage of their population had died. So they had suffered. I get it, they started it, I get it, although some of you might argue that the North, you know, okay, but Lincoln was trying to be conciliatory, he was. So he picks Andrew Johnson because of Johnson's loyalty to the Union, and it's kind of just an olive branch a little bit to the South. And his thought was, what harm could this possibly cause? Because he's just the vice president. What could possibly go wrong? And of course, you know what possibly went wrong. Abraham Lincoln gets assassinated, and then we have a pro-slavery president who is guiding the United States as we're reconstructing the Union. So that turns out to be a little bit of a problem, okay, a lot of a problem, because here we are trying to decide how to make sure that newly freed slaves have rights, and the guy in charge of this whole process, and I recognize we have divided government in 3 branches and federalism, I do recognize that, but the president's fairly important in these processes. So in charge of this entire process, we have Andrew Johnson, who at one time said that that every family should have a slave to relieve the drudgery of daily life. And he had grown up poor in the South, and his frustration about slavery was not that people had slaves, but that not everyone had slaves. He resented that rich people had all the slaves in the South and poor people didn't have any. So he's probably not the best person to be in charge during Reconstruction, but there he is. So what are we going to do? Okay, I'm checking the chat. Okay, so it's back to joining the audio if you needed to. Why didn't they let other Southern politicians? Yeah, there's a whole bunch of stuff going on there, and I'll go ahead and pull up the notes for chapter 15 here in a minute, and we'll start to get into kind of the official book stuff, and we'll go back over it a little bit next time too if you don't have your book yet. But when I'm talking about Johnson coming to Congress, no one really prevented them from coming. Since they seceded, they formed their own country and decided they weren't a part of the United States anymore, except Andrew Johnson, who thought that they still were. And then you are definitely right about once Reconstruction starts, and we'll talk about this here in a few minutes, but Johnson decided he would just pardon a whole bunch of Southerners and that they could come back to Congress however they felt. And then when they got there, Congress said, heck no, we're not letting these guys back in because they were the guys who were here when everything started and they caused this mess. So we don't want them back in Congress. We'll make the rules about Reconstruction. So one of the requirements that they eventually say, which Garrett mentions, is that you have to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Yeah, or 13th and 14th. 15th they just passed. And 13th is passed during this, starts at the end of the Civil War, and then is passed right as the Civil War ends or ratified and then added without Southern consent. And the same is true of the 14th Amendment. The 15th technically happens while the South is back in the Union, even though they're not really voting on stuff. So there are sometimes, oh, somebody needs to come in, sorry. There's sometimes people who would argue that the 13th and 14th and possibly 15th Amendments don't really apply to Southern states, but that would be, I wouldn't make that argument. I wouldn't, because one, people will say like, why are you being so racist? And then two, it's not a great legal argument because they voluntarily left the Union. They had the opportunity to participate in the process and chose not to. So it would also be like saying that amendments that pass before your state becomes a state don't apply to your state. So it's not a great legal argument. Plus, people are going to think you might be racist if you make that argument. It's sort of like if you're one of those people that say, I know Hitler was a bad guy, but he was a good speaker. Yeah, don't do that. All right. Do you guys have any other questions while I take a drink of Coke Zero and look to see if you have any? All right, for those of you that came in maybe a minute or two late, Purple Book, that's the one. Okay, I know you could go back and watch this video. But, all right. All right, so I think maybe what we'll do just to kind of get started is I'll share what I will probably use as my lecture notes. And then I will post these. Let me find a better way to look at these. You don't want to see chapter 17, sorry. Goodness. But I'll post these, I'll probably post them right after class. I may revise them a little bit more. It's the main reason that I hadn't put them up yet is I was still kind of in the process of revising, but it probably doesn't hurt for you to see them right now. And I'll go ahead and post them and I'll let you know if I change very much. Okay. Now I don't want to go like super far into this. Somebody stole, what? Somebody stole your textbook? That is the craziest thing I've ever heard. Yeah. I know they must have thought it was something much cooler than your textbook. No offense, I like the textbook pretty well for a textbook. Oh, speaking of the textbook. Okay. So I know that I've heard from some of you, like my professor, some other class said, hey, let's get the book, but let's not really use the book. I really kind of focus on the book, and it's not because, you know, it's the greatest book ever written or it's the authority on U.S. history. It's a good book, and Dr. Foner is a fine historian, and he still writes regularly and lectures regularly. He's a good historian. I got to hear him a couple of years ago. He's got podcasts online if you're super interested, because, I mean, who doesn't enjoy watching a good history podcast? He's a solid kind of middle of the road historian, but my thought is it's just an easier way to have just one source where you can go and look up the stuff. When I took this class 82,000 years ago, actually it was in 1984. When I took this class in 1984, my professor, you know, we didn't have computers, and she didn't give us notes, and she didn't have a standard textbook. So she would just talk about stuff, and it was really kind of random, I thought. And, oh yeah, book, sorry. Purple. But if you have the 5th edition, which I think is orange, I think it's pretty close. So if you have the 5th edition, and the link that I put in there is to the 5th edition, and I think you could actually download that, which I think is probably a bad idea, but you can scroll through and use that until yours comes, or if somebody stole your book from your front porch, that's the craziest thing. But back to my 1984 experience, sorry. I could never figure out what was going to be on the test. And we didn't have a single source of information. And that kind of drove me crazy as a student. So I know some of you are not used to using the textbook, but I like the textbook because it's kind of straightforward. It's pretty nicely written, and it's kind of short for a textbook. Now, still, if you're not used to reading a textbook, I wouldn't try to read a whole chapter at once, take a break in there, but I would read it. And somebody also asked if you have to have certain materials for the class. That's all up to you. I mean, you may want to take notes. You may have an e-version where you can take them online. If you have a physical version, you may want to highlight stuff. I know I was kind of weird, and when I was a student, I would use Post-it notes and take notes on the Post-it notes and leave them in the book so I'd know, you know, where the note was from. And I'll post my notes after today, and so you could print those and then maybe write stuff in there, or open up a document with those and then add to them or highlight stuff that you thought was important. But I would take notes while I read, and maybe during the lectures when they're a little more organized. Today's isn't going to be like super structured, but I would mostly just to keep myself paying attention, to be honest, because there's so many ways to get distracted, which You already know. All right. So when the Civil War ends, the North is oddly enough in pretty good shape. Most of the battles did not occur in the North. I know that you're probably aware of that. And the couple that did went very poorly for the South. So most of the fighting's in the South. Therefore, most of the destruction is in the South. Now, both the North and the South end up in debt after the Civil War, but the amount of debt in the South is much bigger compared to the size of their economy. Plus, the Northern economy is more diverse, so it's going to have a better time recovering than the Southern economy. And that's going to stay true for a very long time. Now, in the modern era, I mean, part of the reason probably some of you live here is because the Southern economy is pretty strong compared to the Northern economy in most ways. And, you know, maybe you didn't move here on purpose, but your parents might have, or somebody moved here because, you know, we have jobs. And jobs are really important. Like I have relatives who live in Wisconsin and Ohio, and they don't have as many jobs, and that's bad. So jobs are good. During this time period, your job in the South was probably related to cotton. It probably was. You were either growing cotton, harvesting cotton, working. If you have a job, I'm well aware, and I don't mean to overlook this. Clearly, most of the plantation labor is slavery, and you guys had. I mean, I assume that you've had the first half of this class or something about U.S. history at some point in your life where you talked about how plantations primarily grew cotton and most of the labor was done by slaves. And while most people in the South did not own slaves, most of the slaves in the United States clearly by this time were in the South, and they were owned by a very small percentage of the population who controlled pretty much everything in the South. The education system, the political system, and the financial system. So slavery, even though most people in the South did not participate in slavery as owners, almost everybody's affected by that land owning elite, plantation owning, slave owning group of folks who controlled how the South ran. And even though some people had suggested that the Southern economy was too dependent upon cotton, there really weren't a whole lot of people who suggested it was too dependent on slavery during that time period. At least not a lot of people in the South. There were some, but there weren't a lot. They were concerned that the Southern economy was too dependent upon cotton. They don't want to diversify the economy because they make so much money selling their cotton, especially pre-Civil War, primarily to England and France, where you're starting to see factory systems develop. And you're starting to see a little bit of that in the United States as the Civil War begins. The Waltham or Lowell systems that you may have talked about in 1301, which are, or 8th grade history, sorry if this is your first class. And then those are primarily, you know, along rivers or Massachusetts, kind of New England area, where they're making textiles, and textiles just cloth. So it's you know, back in those days you bought cloth and then you made your own clothes. So, and that's when the Southern plantation owners are smuggling the cotton up to the North during the Civil War. That's who they're selling to. They're selling to the cotton mill, or excuse me, the textile mills in New England. Now, because the North is really good at blockading the coast, the overseas market for cotton really dries up for the South. France and England start buying it from Northern Africa, maybe Venezuela and India a little bit, but more Northern Africa, Egypt, that sort of region or that part of the world. And then when the Civil War ends, King Cotton is pretty much destroyed. So the South doesn't have a place overseas to sell their cotton. They primarily sell it to the North. That'll turn out to be okay-ish as time goes along, but they will never ever, the South, will never ever regain 80 to 90% of the international cotton market, which they had before, which is why there was so much wealth associated with cotton growing. But that is going to be destroyed by the Civil War, in addition to lots of lives and land and that sort of thing. And one thing that ended was the institution of slavery. Now, you're aware, I trust, that Emancipation Proclamation happens in 1863, and that it sort of kind of frees some slaves. And you probably know that because the South is not paying any attention to Abraham Lincoln, and they're not, you know, they're the Confederacy now. So they really don't care that Abraham Lincoln says all the slaves in the South are freed. But African Americans in the North did care. And they said, so this changes the focus of the war away from preserving the Union to ending slavery in some ways. So you see hundreds of thousands of African Americans in the North volunteering to fight for the Union. And that makes an enormous difference in the war effort. Also, here's another thing. We have some border states where they still had slavery during this time period. And then people started to talk about how it might be slightly hypocritical to have slavery in the North when you just said they can't have it in the South anymore. So you start to begin the process of ending slavery in those border states during that time period. And if you've studied the Civil War in a little more depth, you'll notice that each time the North gets control of a state, one of the first things they do is free the slaves. So you can't really do that if you still have slaves in the border states, which are along the edge and are still part of the Union, but got to keep their slaves. And those states were, let me see if I remember, Missouri, Kentucky, West Virginia is not a state yet. Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, Kentucky. Maybe it was just those three. Clearly, we're not going to have a quiz about the border states. So, yeah, no, it's not part of our class anyway, so sorry. All right. So by the time the Civil War has ended, there are no slaves in the North. That emancipation has already taken place. And the 13th Amendment has already been devised and is in the process of ratification. And the South is required to follow it. So when the war is over, then slavery is over as well. So we've got drastic change of the economy, plus there's no more slavery in the South. So plantation owners may have to do some of their own work, and they're not going to be plantation owners anymore exactly because they can't have slaves. Now, as you know how this goes, so it doesn't mean that African Americans get all of their freedoms and become equal during this time period, but you may be surprised at how much equality actually does occur eventually during this time period. Not right at first and not through the entire period, but there are reasons that you'll see African Americans voting and being elected to local, state, and national offices, being appointed as ambassadors, being advisors to presidents, although really that's primarily Frederick Douglass, and that's primarily Abraham Lincoln. As you can guess, Andrew Johnson is not going to have any African American advisors, and you would be right about that. So, all right, I'm going to stop sharing for just a sec, okay, because I feel like I missed a question. Okay. All right, no, you guys are just talking about the book. That's cool. Sorry. Back to the notes. Sorry. Okay. All right. So, Reconstruction, we should probably talk about what that means. So when people in general talk about Reconstruction, they're talking about the time period after the Civil War where the North and the South are brought back together. So it's often refers to a time period, but it also can refer to the physical reconstruction, like where we're rebuilding things or putting back the political system. But in general, it just means bringing the North and the South back together. And it's a reference to that time period after the Civil War, but before the Gilded Age. So And a lot of federal contracts are issued during that time period to fix roads and bridges and physical things that were destroyed. So you will probably see some corruption during that time period that's related to economics. And if you've studied this period some, you'll notice that Civil War pensions seem to go on for about 60 years after this. So when people have an opportunity to get money from the government, most people, use it thoughtfully and wisely and appreciate the assistance. And then there's always a scammer. So you'll notice a little bit of scamming going on during this time period, because you can. There's always that part of human nature that I think says, I will take the free stuff because I can, not because I need it, and then extends it for a long period of time. And these are people, sometimes the Southerners refer to these people as scalawags and carpetbaggers. Now, scalawags, and somebody told me once that these are terms that you also hear in SpongeBob SquarePants, but I don't watch that, so I don't know. But scalawags, in general, used to be kind of scoundrels, but this specific political reference is to people from the South who cooperate with the Union government or the US government at this point during Reconstruction, primarily to gain profit during the rebuilding. So they probably get contracts to rebuild roads or bridges, or I would say schools, but we don't build a whole lot of schools in the South during this time period. But these are Southerners. Scalawags are Southerners, they're both S's, and they cooperate with the rebuilding rather than fighting against it. And then carpetbaggers, and you occasionally hear this term, I think still, carpetbaggers are people who come from another state, in this instance from the North, to the South to assist with Reconstruction. So carpetbaggers are the people from out of town, and the scalawags are the people from the local folks, the folks from the South who are going to assist with Reconstruction. And a lot of them, both of those groups, are kind of looked down upon by traditional, what they'll eventually refer to as redeemers, people who are trying to restore the South to its past greatness and whatever. So they're more than trying, I'm sorry, I should explain why I have that kind of tone in my voice. They're more than trying to rebuild the South and make sure that it's prosperous again. They're trying to reconstruct the institution of slavery in as legal a way as they can. And as you're guessing, they're going to be fairly successful as that as time goes along. All right, we'll talk about a couple more things and then I'll probably stop because, again, I don't want to go too far because I know you don't all have your books yet, but I think all of this stuff is fairly introductory and not too painful, so hopefully we're good. Now, do you guys have any questions that you want to ask at this moment? Okay, I'm looking. Okay.
Can you go over the carpetbaggers again, please?
Yeah. And yeah, there's something in the chat that I don't understand. I'm going to say old person problem, maybe. And then one of you says, no, we shouldn't talk about it. So you're probably right. Okay, so carpetbaggers are people from the North who go to the South to help during Reconstruction. And a lot of these are people who go to the South to get federal contracts to rebuild. And there's a whole lot of, I hadn't mentioned this yet, but we'll get to it eventually next time. There are lots of these government contracts that are being issued in a very sketchy sort of way, honestly illegal sort of way in Congress. So Congress is giving contracts to their friends and relatives, sometimes to themselves, and they're overpaying themselves so that they can hire subcontractors to do the work. So the carpetbaggers are seen as people who really don't want to help. They want to make profit off of the rebuilding and essentially off the suffering of the Southerners whose lives were destroyed during the Civil War. And the difference between carpetbaggers and scalawags tends to be where they're from. They called them carpetbaggers, I should have pointed this out, because they came with suitcases, which were referred to as carpet bags. And they called them carpet bags because their suitcases were made out of carpet back in those days. So carpetbaggers were guys with suitcases, out-of-towners, foreigners who came in to try to fix stuff. Now, if you, clearly you live in the Austin area, sometimes we talk about, and no offense, because I'm sure some of you are in this category, people from California. People from California are coming to Texas and they're ruining it because they're bringing their crazy California liberal values and they're going to turn us into a bunch of socialists. So we sometimes think of Californians as carpetbaggers because they're coming from out of town and they're going to bring their values in and their politics and they're going to ruin what we have. Again, no offense if you're from California, just supposed to be an example. If you want to look for a political example that's a little older, people in New York who maybe weren't as excited about Senator Hillary Clinton, maybe, 15, 20 years ago, referred to her as a carpetbagger because she just moved to New York so she could run for Senate, is what they said. That there was probably some truth to that. There were probably some other reasons she moved to New York. I'm sure it's lovely. All right. Does that help with carpetbaggers? Was that too much? Are we good? Do you want more?
Yes, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. So scalawags and carpetbaggers, kind of the same, just different where they're from. And there we go. All right. So changes for former slaves. Clearly, 13th Amendment ends slavery. That's a big change. In theory, that's a huge change. In practice, well, it is a huge change in practice, but, and your question, your pre-prepared question for this unit is Reconstruction a success or a failure? And typically when you get a question like that, the answer is yes. So, excuse me, in some ways it's successful and in some ways it's a failure. Now, one of the things that's clearly successful is slavery ends. I mean, there's the 13th Amendment, slavery ends. That's amazing. I mean, it fulfills some promise of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence. Yes, I'll put the lecture notes on Blackboard. So the 13th Amendment and the end of slavery, clearly amazing. Not enforcing the 14th and 15th Amendments very well, going to be a problem. Definitely going to be a problem. One of the things that does seem to work nicely is the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is created before the Civil War ends and extends through the period of Reconstruction. And it's an agency, it's a government agency to help former slaves adjust to the end of slavery. And really what they were supposed to do, a couple of things. The one big thing that never happened, and you could easily list this in why Reconstruction didn't work well, is it was supposed to redistribute land from former plantations. There was a lot of discussion as the Civil War ended by much more radical Republican types that when the war ended, that the land owned by the plantation owners should be split up and divided and given to slaves. And there are a variety of reasons that seemed like a good idea at the time. One, if you lived in the South, the only possible way that you were going to be financially independent, I shouldn't say only, but the main way, is if you had farmland, because it's an agricultural economy. So unless you were able to get money and start a business, which you could if you lived in a city, or buy, what is the thing that processes the cotton? The cotton gin. Why could I not think of that? Unless you're able to buy the cotton gin in a rural place, it was going to be hard for you to make money unless you owned land. So the key to wealth in the South during that time period, and honestly in a lot of the North as well, was land ownership. And slaves have been robbed of their freedom, but they'd also been robbed of the proceeds of their labor. They'd never been paid, and neither had their parents, and neither had their grandparents and their great-grandparents. So the way that families amass wealth over generations was not possible for slaves. So the thought was the one way we could maybe give these guys a legitimate economic chance is to divide up plantations and give them land. Now, that did happen in a few places. It happened primarily in South Carolina and a little bit in Georgia. And this was when General Sherman was able to take over certain parts of those states. And then they redistributed land to former slaves who ran the plantations for a year or two until the Civil War ended and had great economic success. When the Civil War ended, and Johnson becomes president after Lincoln's assassination, he is definitely not supportive of that, and the land reverts back to the slave owners. So redistribution of land doesn't happen. And if you were to ever ask me, we had free time and we were hanging out at Starbucks, and you said like, hey, Serna, what do you think the greatest failure of Reconstruction would be? And I would say that there was no economic redistribution to slaves. And then some of you might say, but that sounds like socialism. Like, no, that sounds like repaying people for their labor would be my answer. So redistributing or distributing land to former slaves was supposed to go through the Freedmen's Bureau. And if you've ever heard talk about 40 acres and a mule, that was what was talked about, that each adult in the family was supposed to get 40 acres and a mule, and then they would have an opportunity to have their own land. And what you saw in South Carolina and Georgia was a lot of times families putting those pieces of land together and having larger farms, because apparently larger farms are more productive. I haven't really I'm not a farmer, so I don't know. But I know that, 40 acres is probably not enough unless you're growing organic broccoli or grapes or something. So definitely not enough for cotton. All right, so redistribution of land was supposed to happen through the Freedmen's Bureau. It doesn't really. Reuniting slave families that have been separated, that does happen pretty well. So slave owners kept lots of records when they sold folks, so they knew where they went. And when the war was over, they were able to help families reunite, find their relatives. So depressing and good and depressing all at once. And then teaching former slaves basic literacy. Here's another truth. If you can't read and write, it's going to be really easy for you to get scammed. So the thought was they needed to make sure that African Americans who had been enslaved could read and write well enough to participate in day-to-day commerce. And they were fairly successful at this, teaching especially adults basic literacy skills so that they were up to the level of the average white person in the South. Now, to be fair, getting up to the average literacy of the average white person in the South was not as difficult as you might think, which sounds terrible, but plantation owners ran the governments and the economic systems, and they didn't necessarily want poor white people to have a lot of education either, because their thought was, if they were the most educated group, I don't know that there's a place where they necessarily articulated all of these thoughts, but if there wasn't public education that was, well funded, that sort of thing, and you kept the average person, at a lower level of literacy and education, then it was less likely that they would somehow rise up and take what you had. So they didn't really have this view of economics where the more we all make, the more is possible and the better we all are. They had the idea that there was a fixed amount of stuff that people could own, and if you got more of it, I necessarily got less of it, so I don't want you to be prosperous because then I would be less prosperous. So folks in the South who controlled the economic, political, and education systems thought that it was best not to share those resources with other people. So the average white person in the South was barely literate, if they were. So, they could maybe read a sales contract, they could write well enough to sign things, So getting former slaves to that level of literacy was a success, but it also wasn't a super high bar, but it was important. So I'm not trying to discount it at all. It was important, but I'm also suggesting that public school average literacy in the South was not super high. Now, if you're wondering, was it in the North? Yeah, it depends on where you live. For whatever reason, there are certain places, certain states that really valued literacy. Massachusetts would be one of those places. Inner cities, sometimes surprisingly enough, because we have certain stereotypes about inner city schools, had better school systems because they had more people, and a lot of times too, immigrants would have school-based private schools that a lot of their kids went to. And while the focus on those types of schools was really making sure that your religious education was strong, in that process, they would also make sure that your literacy was strong as well. So some cities had decent schools. Massachusetts in general had very good school systems from the beginning, thanks to the Puritans. I know we don't always thank the Puritans for things, but they really did want everyone, male and female, regardless of your ethnicity. They wanted everyone reading. So did, oh goodness, the folks that lived in Pennsylvania. I'm really just blanking today. Quakers. But Quakers didn't really control Pennsylvania's government as long, and they certainly didn't control it, in this era. And places like, for some reason, like the Northwest, like Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, those states really valued education, and a lot of that had to do with the immigrant groups who came in there. So basic literacy in the North wasn't super strong, likely better than the South, and then getting basic literacy for former slaves up to where it needed to be was not a high bar, but it was a bar. And then basic medical care. Now, during this time period, you probably don't want too much medical care because they're still occasionally using leeches, and they don't know so much about germs. And their basic treatment is if it's broken, cut it off. So this is not a high point for medical care, but what they are starting to find out during this time period is keeping things clean matters. So just basic general public health, cleanliness, that sort of stuff. So, yeah. I mean, you don't want too much medical care in this era, but by the time we get to the 20th century, it's much better. And they learn a lot during wars. So they learned a whole lot about cleanliness, that sort of stuff during the Civil War. All right. And then the other stuff we'll talk about really quickly, and then I'll stop because I promised you I would. Amendment. Okay. One of the most important things that happens during this time period and brings changes for former slaves are 3 amendments that are passed during this era. 13th Amendment, which ends slavery, and that's passed. I really should have put the dates there. I'm sorry I did not. I may go and add that before I post the notes. The 13th Amendment ends slavery, and that is accomplished by the Civil War, during the Civil War, and then the amendment as the Civil War ends. The 14th Amendment provides citizenship and equal protection under the law for former slaves. That's the purpose of the 14th Amendment. And I know it does other things. I'm aware of this. The 14th Amendment is the reason that we say if you're born here, you're a citizen. So in the 20th and 21st century, the rights have been expanded through the 14th Amendment, and the idea of equal protection under the law for all citizens expands to people. Well, women would be a group that it'll expand to, and just people of every background. And then in court cases in the late 1800s and then through the 1900s, 20th century, will also decide that if you live in a territory, any official part of the United States, whether it's a territory or a state or any other place controlled by the United States government, you also have these constitutional rights. It took us a while to come to that conclusion, but not 100 years, like 30. So we And then 13th and 14th Amendments, this is not going to be on the test or quiz, but were created in part to reverse the Dred Scott decision. And you may or may not remember the Dred Scott decision, but the Dred Scott decision happens in the 1850s. It's one of those things leading up to the Civil War. And it says that if you're African American, that you can't be a citizen. Dred Scott was a slave. He had lived in slave territory and free territory. He filed suit with the U.S. Judicial system, and the suit went all the way to the Supreme Court, asserting that because he had lived in free territory, he should be a free man. And what the Supreme Court said in its very conservative nature during that time period was, Dred Scott doesn't have the right to file a suit because he's not a citizen. And you have to be a citizen to appeal to the Supreme Court. And he's not a citizen because he's Black, not because he's a slave, but because he's Black. And that caused a huge amount of problems. And then the other thing that they added was, no state has the right to restrict slavery. Yeah, that didn't help either. So, and maybe, you know, if you ever had to talk about things that led to the Civil War, you won't for this class, but the Dred Scott decision may have been one of those things that increased that argument. So the 13th and 14th Amendment are written in some ways specifically to make the Dred Scott decision null, you know, to make sure that nobody could say, well, the Dred Scott decision says you're not a citizen. The 13th and 14th Amendment takes care of all that stuff. And then the 15th Amendment allows former slaves to vote. And this will eventually be interpreted to mean just men, because women's groups will say like, hey, how about us? And some Black women will try to vote as well, and they'll be discouraged, arrested, and then they'll have to pass their own amendment. And this will lead to a split in the women's movement about Black men being allowed to vote. So it won't be the high point of feminism when you see things that women's groups wrote about the 15th Amendment, about how it wasn't fair to allow uneducated, ignorant Black men to vote, and I'm cleaning that up a lot, when white women who were more sensible and educated weren't able to vote. So it's, again, not going to be the best moment for feminism, and it's going to bring out some controversy. And what will happen is the women's movement will split, like half of them pro 15th Amendment and half of them fought against it, which is going to look and going to be racist. I mean, it's more than just looking racist. All right, I feel like that's probably a nice place to stop, because I feel like I've probably overloaded you with information. Yeah, the 15th Amendment, big deal for other ethnicities. I'm gonna say briefly. You're really not gonna see, gosh. African American men are not gonna get to vote in the South for very long, because pretty quickly during Reconstruction, Southern states are going to add restrictions to where they're not voting at all. And it's part of the reason the KKK develops. It's not the whole reason, but it's part of the reason, is to keep Black men from voting, to scare them, kill them, keep them from voting. And eventually, there are just laws put in place that make sure that Black men can't vote in the South. It sort of depends on which state you're in, how possible it is to vote if you're male and not white. And there are going to be some states that are going to say that if you're not Black, you're white. And that'll happen a lot for Mexican Americans or Hispanic men. And in some instances, that's useful and leads to the right to vote until people maybe push back against it. In other instances, it's not useful, like juries. If you want a jury of your peers and technically you're white, even though you're maybe your roots are Mexican or you're Mexican American, and your whole jury is a whole bunch of people that maybe don't like Mexican Americans. That was an issue in Texas. It was. And in the West Coast, it's really more of an issue about white and Asian. And on the West Coast, they will eventually pass really specific anti-Asian laws that prevent property ownership, that prevent voting. And also, one of the things they'll do is they'll add literacy tests to voting requirements, which are not standardized tests. So that way, whoever the voter registrar is can give you an individual test, which will ensure that you will fail. So most local jurisdictions will find ways to keep you from voting if they don't want you to vote, excuse me. And that's also why voter registration eventually, and by eventually I mean 1960s, becomes a federal obligation rather than a state obligation. And if you hear people talking about suspension of the Voting Rights Act in southern states, which has happened recently, part of the reason people are upset about that is historically local jurisdictions used voter registration techniques as a way to keep people from voting rather than making voter registration more efficient, if that makes sense. Is definitely the long answer. Okay, and then hopefully I don't know, you'll start to learn that sometimes I give the long answer. So if it's enough at some point, you can post like, hey, that's enough. But I like the long answer. Okay, thanks. I appreciate it. All right. So before we go for today, and I know it's a little short, I just didn't want to get too far into it before all of you got your books, plus I hadn't posted the notes, and yeah, I don't know. I won't feel bad about talking too much later. And at some point too, we'll try to figure out ways where we can get you more involved in the discussion if you want to be. I know you may not all want to talk, but you also may not all want to listen to me talk for an hour. I get that. All right, so before we go, do you guys have any questions? And as soon as we're done, because I have time before my noon class, I'll go ahead and post the notes that I have thus far, just knowing that I might occasionally revise them or something. And I would probably do that during class and then just repost them after class. All right. Oh, and I forgot to take the screenshot because we had talked about that too, screenshot. Okay. All right. Screenshot. Before next class, if you can start reading chapter 15, that would be cool.
I have a question.
Oh, please do. I'm trying to figure out how to do the screenshot. So
Okay.
you go and I'll.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
Is there like a reason why, like in history books that they don't really include like mentioning Asian Americans or Mexican Americans? Like,
yeah, there are reasons. None of them are really good. Some of them are books are old.
yeah.
Sometimes. You'll notice in this book there's a discussion of all kinds of folks that you don't normally see discussed. Also, if you have only taken a high school history class, the reason they write a high school history book is to sell a high school history book. So they want to make sure it doesn't offend anyone. And by anyone, they mean people who buy textbooks, who are primarily curriculum guys in school districts who are probably, they probably are not looking for very much diversity in their history books. So they just buy kind of middle of the road general stuff. And then we went through a phase in the teaching of history where they thought, well, let's just have like little inserts about women or African Americans or Asian Americans to kind of offset the fact that we didn't include them in the entire story, which doesn't make any sense. And I think more modern textbooks do a much better job. And I think this book does a better job. So,
I was just wondering that, like,
Yeah, no, it's a fair question. It is. And I know, as a high school teacher, I talked for a very long time to my curriculum coordinator about how we needed to make sure that the story of US history, and I don't even want to say is more inclusive because is accurate. And some of it too, and I know some of you are probably thinking this, history is written by the winners. That is true as well. So whoever writes the history sometimes controls how it's learned. And it's not even, I was going to say, it's not even that some of the old history books were wrong. That's not true. I mean, when I took this class in high school, it talked about the War of Northern Aggression in my history book, and talked about how really slavery was not that bad. It's like, that's the dumbest thing I ever heard. And I knew that as a teenager, as I'm sure you did as well. In a more modern era, sometimes the book's problem is what it leaves out, not necessarily what it puts in. And we also have to remember when you're taking a survey class, they're really just trying to give you the overview, but the overview should include stuff besides political history and history of, the guys that, the people who controlled stuff. Oh, I forgot to mention that I grew up in the Midwest, so when I say guy, I just mean people. All right, but hopefully we'll get more of the story in here. And your book review is also a nice way to get whatever part of the story you always feel is missing. Oh yeah, yeah, I'm sorry. Whoever asked me about the forgotten pandemic, I'm sorry, I forgot to email you back. Perfect. Yep, and timely. Yep, sounds good. All right, and I'll go back and look at the email too. I'm sorry. I know I got a bunch of emails and answered a bunch, but I know I must have missed one or two. Sorry.
I have a question.
Okay, go ahead.
Between the chapter summary and the notes that you're going to post, how intently do we read the book?
That's a good question. And I don't know if I have a good answer. Definitely read it. I would take notes about things you thought were important, which I know is sort of tricky. And I would suggest to you that the things I thought were important are probably in my notes, so that may help. And then by Friday, I'll post a list of things that you'll definitely want to study for the quiz part of it. But truthfully, you've got to be utilitarian about these things, and you may not have hours and hours to work on my class, which, breaks my heart, but I know it's practical. Look at the questions you have to answer before you read the book, and make sure that in your reading, you're finding out information to answer those questions. I would say that's the main thing, to make sure you can answer the weekly question. And then when you get the list of stuff to study, make sure you're paying attention to those things when you read as well.
Hi, I had just asked in the chat, just with the notes, will you be posting them as we go over them, or all at once? For the whole
What I'll post today is the chapter 15, 16, and 17. I usually have them together with the unit. So, and I may revise them as we go. I'll pull them up. If I add stuff to them, then I'll probably just repost them after class. But you could also add the same stuff as we go along. So.
Sounds good. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Do you guys, I'm scrolling. Do you guys have any other questions before we go? All right. And I hope it wasn't too hard to find the recording online. And I left the recording I made this summer about the book reviews, but I'm not sure if that's visible. Yeah, we've already figured out I'm not great with technology. So I'll probably post the link to that specific recording as well, in case it's hard to find. And I tried to hide all the ones from this summer, so.
I had trouble getting in this morning, but with the Zoom meeting, it's always going to be that same password for every class, right?
It is. It
Okay.
is. Yeah.
Because I
Sorry.
just couldn't click the link, and that's why I was like 10 minutes late. So I apologize.
Oh, no, and I'm sorry you had the difficulty, and I'll go back and look at that and see if there's a way to make that easier, but
Honestly,
really-
now that I know how to do it, it's
You're
totally
good.
fine. Yeah,
Okay,
thank you so much.
okay, good. All right. Yeah, we'll try to figure out a way for things to be a little more interactive. I understand that. So I'll try to, we'll talk about your weekly question at the very least, during these. So, as long as you guys participate, it'll be more interactive, but yeah, I'll work on that too. All right, and you guys are welcome to give suggestions. If you've had something in another class, that you thought, well, that was pretty cool, you can let me know. That's cool. All right, I'm definitely well versed in history, but yeah, the other stuff. All right, anything else before we go? Because I know you want to go. Okay, I'm going to stop recording then. If you want to stay and ask a question, feel free.